When extreme weather hits Florida, the destruction can be immense. Hurricane Idalia caused $3.6 billion in damage when it barreled into the Big Bend last year. That's what the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration estimates. And cleaning it up is tough, dirty, and dangerous work. The workers are often left without adequate protection as they deal with toxic mold, dust, and other hazardous environments. I'm Matthew Petty, and today on Florida Matters, we'll talk with journalist Maria Inez Zamudio about her reporting on the dangerous conditions facing immigrant workers doing disaster restoration work. But first, we'll talk about another group of workers in Florida, people whose jobs are outside, like farm workers and construction workers. With the summer heat approaching, we look at the potential impact of a new law that bans local governments from mandating heat protections, like shade and water breaks for outdoor workers. WUSF's Jessica Mazzaros reports on the environment and climate change and has been covering the rules around heat protection ordinances for outdoor workers. Jessica, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Can you just remind us about the debate over heat protections for outdoor workers during the legislative session? What were worker advocates asking for and who was pushing back?
Sure. So this actually stemmed from Miami-Dade County being close to mandating heat protections for outdoor workers there. Protections like access to shade, water, rest breaks, and heat safety training. Outdoor worker advocates like the membership-based organization We Count were fighting for this local regulation in South Florida. But this nearly passing in Miami-Dade stirred up big business people like billionaire Jorge Perez, who's also known as the Miami Condo King. He co-wrote an op-ed in the Miami Herald saying that heat regulations would cripple the construction and agriculture industries. So this concern eventually went up to the legislature, which wrote the heat preemption into House Bill 433, which is also referred to as the Employment Regulations Bill. With regards to heat, now local governments won't be allowed to mandate these protections outside of state and federal rules.
So it sounds like the argument against mandating things like water and shade breaks for workers is basically it's going to kill the economy.
Yeah, as I mentioned, the head of one of the largest real estate development firms in the country, Jorge Perez, wrote an op-ed in the Miami Herald along with the CEO of Costa Farms, Jose Smith. They make the case that these local regulations would burden the construction and agriculture industries. They say it would be a new set of overreaching regulations and penalties, while both industries already comply with federal heat standards issued and enforced by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration. Now, OSHA does have a general duty rule which requires employers to provide workplaces that are, quote, free from recognized hazards that are causing or are likely to cause death or serious physical harm. And the federal agency does list extreme heat as one of those standards, but advocates say it's rarely enforced.
Now, the bill that was eventually signed by the governor, what exactly does it do?
So the Employment Regulations Bill has some other preemptions on minimum wage and benefits, but with regards to heat exposure, it stops local governments from creating any requirements around employees' exposure to heat or sun, or to otherwise address or moderate the effects of such exposure. So I'm going to list off some of the bill copy of like what it bans the local governments from mandating: employee monitoring and protection, water consumption, cooling measures, acclimation and recovery periods or practices, posting or distributing notices or materials that inform employees how to protect themselves from heat exposure, implementation and maintenance of heat exposure programs or training, appropriate first aid measures or emergency responses related to heat exposure, protections for employees who report they have experienced excessive heat exposure, and finally, reporting and record-keeping requirements. So Governor Ron DeSantis signed this bill on the evening of April 11th quietly with no ceremony, but at a press conference for another bill signing the next day, he was asked about it. And basically, he said this legislation didn't come from him, but from the Miami-Dade delegation in response to the local ordinance there. Here he is at a press conference.
I think they were pursuing something that was going to cause a lot of problems down there. So I think a lot of the members of the Dade delegation created that just to steer clear of those problems.
So thinking about the impacts of this, you talked to a farm worker in Parrish, which is in Manatee County. It's about an hour's drive from Sarasota. Let's just take a listen to Lucia Lopez.
No todos los días son iguales. Entonces, sí hay días que te perjudica o te molesta, como dándote dolor de cabeza, que sientes que te deshidratas.
So Lopez is saying every day is not the same. There are some days that feel more harmful than others. Like some days you can get a headache and you can feel dehydrated.
And then what did she tell you essentially about how she and her fellow workers are trained to deal with the heat?
Well, Lopez described the layers of clothing that they have to wear to protect themselves from the sun: bandanas to cover the face, hats, long sleeve shirts, and thick pants and shoes to actually protect them from the chemicals used on the farm. And she says all of that can feel suffocating in the heat. As for breaks for shade and water, she says it's up to each individual worker to decide when they want to stop, but they're not salaried. So the more you work, the more you get paid, and taking breaks costs money. So the incentive, she says, is to keep working.
And what about this new rule banning local ordinances mandating those kind of heat protections we've been talking about? What did Lucia have to say about that?
Yeah, she says that she's sad Florida won't have local protections in place for workers like her. Let's hear her speak in her own words.
Yo sé que la vida no es garantizada, ni porque uno tenga el mejor médico al lado, ¿verdad? Pero si algo pudieran hacer, pues sería de mucho agrado para nosotros que el gobierno protegiera o diera un poco más de protección.
She says she understands that life is not guaranteed, but she'd like to have better access to more immediate medical care, and she'd greatly appreciate any protections that the government can offer.
So thinking about some of the impacts of this, you've reported on the health risks for outdoor workers when they're exposed to the kind of heat conditions that can get dangerous. What are folks saying about the potential risks of this?
Yeah, I spoke to Shauna Junco. She's a clinical pharmacist, and she's also the board chair of Florida Clinicians for Climate Action. She says local protections would prevent unnecessary deaths from heat illness. This is what she had to say.
Heat illness is called the silent killer amongst the medical community because it's insidious and it's not recognized as a cause of death.
Yeah, she says heat illness is almost always preventable and almost always treatable once the symptoms start to present. But if you don't treat it quickly, it can be deadly, and it can also cause chronic medical conditions or cause worsening of chronic medical conditions for those who already have them.
Now, the new law will take effect July 1st, just over a month from now. What are businesses and outdoor worker advocates doing in the lead up to that? I mean, is anything changing for these workers?
Well, I spoke to an advocate in South Florida with We Count, and they said that they've tried going the legislative route, appealing to the state, appealing to local leaders, but now that those avenues have been blocked, they're going to explore ways outside of the legislative process. One example of that is the Fair Food Program out of Immokalee in Southwest Florida. So it's a voluntary program, essentially a partnership between everyone in the food supply chain: workers, growers, retailers, and of course consumers. And the farmers can report issues without fear. The growers can address those problems. And according to their website, they say that buyers can count on a secure and ethical supply chain. I also heard from the Florida Clinicians for Climate Action, which said that they will be pressuring national agencies like OSHA to put stronger laws into place federally.
And what other protections might those outdoor workers be looking for in the absence of some of these local laws?
Well, going back to the parish farm worker, Lucia Lopez, she thinks the most important thing is to have easier access to medical care because oftentimes the closest clinic to a farm can be 30 minutes to an hour away. And she thinks there should be paramedics or medical assistants close by on the farm because she and her colleagues are not trained for that. And as we heard from Shauna Junco, time is of the essence and people need to get help right away when they're exhibiting symptoms of heat illness.
We've been speaking with WUSF's Jessica Mazzaros, who reports on the environment and climate change and has been covering the rules around heat protection ordinances for outdoor workers. You can find more on our website, wusf.org. Jessica, thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Matt.
You're listening to Florida Matters. Up next, as hurricane season approaches, we'll talk about the working conditions that face disaster recovery workers who help rebuild communities after a storm. Welcome back to Florida Matters. We've been talking about the hazardous conditions facing outdoor workers in the heat of summer. Let's turn now to another group of workers, those who pitch in after a hurricane or other disaster to clean up and rebuild. Latino USA, a weekly show heard here on WUSF, recently featured an investigation into this. The Center for Public Integrity, Futuro Investigates, and Columbia Journalism Investigations explored the working conditions facing Latino immigrants who travel from disaster site to disaster site. Those workers are exposed to toxins like lead, asbestos, and mold, but in many cases, they're not provided the right safety equipment. Journalist Maria Inez Zamudio with the Center for Public Integrity was part of the team that worked on the investigation. Maria Inez Zamudio with the Center for Public Integrity is the lead reporter for Latino USA's investigation into toxic working conditions facing Latino disaster restoration workers across the country. Maria Inez, thank you so much for joining us.
Hi, thank you so much for having me, Matthew.
So you and your team spent more than a year investigating the working conditions facing Latino immigrants who work on disaster recovery. And while there's a growing demand for their labor, workers often are faced with dangerous situations and exposed to things like mold, asbestos, and lead with little protection. Why was it important to tell this story now?
Well, Matthew, this was a truly huge endeavor, and we had a really incredible team. And so, the first thing that we need to understand about this industry is that this is a loosely regulated industry that's booming. It moves about $150 billion every single year. And for the most part, the workforce has remained largely invisible. And there's been some reporting on some conditions that they face, including wage theft and things of that nature. But we really wanted to understand what happens to these workers that are exposed to the same toxins from worksite to worksite. And we just, after digging, we realized that there is no official federal data or state data available tracking how many of these workers were getting sick every year. There's also no government agency or advocacy organization that was studying how prolonged exposure to these toxins was affecting the workers' health. So we created this questionnaire to be able to document the exposure part, but then also the symptoms associated with those toxins.
From your reporting, it sounds like what's happening to these workers is a disaster on top of the disasters they're trying to clean up. Is that kind of how you see it?
I would describe it as an industry that has really grown thanks to climate change. And it's also just like an industry that's not regulated. And on the other side of things, you have OSHA, the agency that's tasked with protecting workers, often suspends the enforcement of labor standards after disasters. So you often see a population that is having to advocate for their own worker safety alone. They're very much unprotected. They don't speak the language, and then they don't have legal status. So oftentimes they show up, they get hired, and they get exposed to all these toxins. And some of these companies don't have any responsibility over workers because most of the times they are hired by third parties, by labor contractors. So oftentimes you see this population just being completely vulnerable.
Mm-hmm. Now, your investigation goes into detail with a couple of workers from Honduras, two brothers who were living in Texas when Hurricane Katrina hit the US in 2005, and then they moved to New Orleans to work on disaster recovery. I want to play a little bit of sound from your interview with them, so let's listen to that now.
He wears his black hair in a tapered buzz cut, revealing a scar in the back of his head. It's an unwanted souvenir from a fall off a roof while he was working after Hurricane Michael in 2018. The contractor that hired him didn't give him a safety harness. When I asked Mariano how many hurricanes he's helped clean, he gives me a long list.
¿Y los trabajó todos, como por ejemplo el de Sandy?
Sí.
Okay. ¿El de Matthew?
Sí.
¿El de Harvey?
Harvey.
¿Irma?
Irma.
¿Florence?
Florence también.
Híjole.
I mean, what's really striking to me about that, Maria Inez, is it's just a long laundry list of disasters. And you're like, yep, I was there at that one too. And then he brings his brother into the conversation too. And what did his brother tell you?
So these two brothers have worked together since Hurricane Katrina hit. They both actually took the bus from Texas, where they were living at the time, to look for employment in New Orleans after Katrina. And the working conditions that they discover are, pretty dire. And they go into detail about, the working conditions, being exposed to mold, being exposed to the stench in New Orleans. And they also talk about not only the workplace accidents, because this work is very dangerous. Mariano fell off the roof. Santos lost his eyesight temporarily. So these are really dangerous jobs. And yet the most enduring problem that both of them had was asthma, right? Like having those breathing problems every single night. In fact, you'll hear this in the audio doc, but at one point I had to stop the interview because Santos was out of breath, like he could not speak anymore. And so you end up seeing how the work has really taken a toll on their bodies. Santos talks about how he has to dab vapor rub under his nose every night to soothe the symptoms. His brother Mariano talks about how sometimes he wakes up in the middle of the night, like tasting blood, and he doesn't know if it's coming from his mouth or his nose. And so, you know, we documented the frequency, right? It's the prolonged exposure to these toxins that has not been studied, and it's one point of this investigation that's really important to note, that it is just this exposure over time that has really taken a toll on their bodies, and showcasing the experiences of these workers, not only from one work site, not only one hurricane back in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina, but also over time. And every single time they're experiencing very similar working conditions, right? Contractors not providing any protective equipment, not training them, which is really key in making sure that these workers are, their exposure to toxins is decreased because of these things, right? And I also want to say that, like, government research really shows that exposure to even small doses of asbestos can have a huge impact on their bodies. It can cause mesothelioma. It's a type of lung cancer. And then chronic exposure to lead can cause reproductive issues, kidney problems, seizures, and mold can also contribute to pulmonary disease and asthma. So we were really trying to document those exposures over time because that's really key.
Another place you visited was Fort Myers, and this was after Hurricane Ian. Let's take a listen to that.
When a white pickup truck stops, dozens of immigrants crowd it. They're wearing dirty jeans, tennis shoes, instead of the construction boots needed to avoid injuries, and they have no other protective equipment. A young man who appears to be in his 20s hangs off the driver's window. He holds a navy blue backpack and stands taller than the men around him, competing for the same job.
¿Qué necesita, jefe?
"What do you need, boss?" he asks the driver. After negotiating the rate, the driver tells the men hovering around, only one.
Uno solo.
The lone worker hops inside. Disappointed, the rest of the sun-kissed laborers walk away to wait for another truck. Most of them are newly arrived and undocumented immigrants from Honduras, Guatemala, Haiti, and other countries. Most are afraid to speak with us about toxin exposure.
So, first of all, is it common from the folks that you spoke to for these workers to travel from disaster to disaster? And then what stood out for you about the conversations that you had with some of the folks, not just here at this work site, but across the scope of this investigation?
So there are two ways that workers arrive at cities after natural disasters. In the case of Hurricane Ian, for example, in Fort Myers, I'm sure that you reported on the devastation. And so shortly after Hurricane Ian hit, there were recruiters. There's usually labor brokers that will reach out to folks via WhatsApp, offering some perks, right? Like, a job that pays above minimum wage, pays for living costs, right? Like they'll offer a place to live, food or transportation costs, like all of these perks. But oftentimes, when the workers arrive at the site, they often find different terms of employment, right? Like the payment per hour might be limited. They may have to be they sometimes are forced to share rooms with other people or other workers. So conditions often change. Another way that people arrive to cities after disasters is that they drive in groups, and they will show up to places like the ones that we described in the audio documentary, which is a labor corner where you see contractors, labor brokers from that area coming in and picking up workers, right? And these workers will get a contract for a day or two. And so, again, in these instances, it is the workers that are having to negotiate workplace safety. They're having to negotiate all of these things with contractors that sometimes leave without paying them, right? So they are, again, really vulnerable. And then what I experienced in Fort Myers, Florida, interviewing these workers is actually something that we documented well in the audio doc, which is that Maria Hinojosa back in 2005 saw the same working conditions. So, what does that say about this workforce? It says that while the industry continues to grow thanks to climate change, there are some billion-dollar companies that are making really great profits. But the workers who are actually cleaning up and helping Americans rebuild their cities are actually facing the same working conditions. This teenager that I spoke with, he was so hungry, and he only had an apple in his backpack for the entire day of working and doing really grueling labor. And my co-host, Maria Hinojosa, like really described how she saw the same thing in 2005. So I think we did a great job sort of showcasing how the working conditions have essentially remained the same for these workers. But when we look at companies like Belfour, like ServPro, and we do a deep dive on ServPro as an example, they're doing really well. They are bought by private firms, and ServPro is $1 billion company.
Mm. We're less than a month from the start of hurricane season, and you talk in your reporting and just as you've been explaining in our conversation now about the fact that because of changing climate, there's more of these storms and the demand for this kind of work is growing. So what does the future look like for this industry in Florida or other states in the Southeast?
I think, I want to take a step back and say that I saw some of the workers I interviewed for this documentary about a week or two ago at a conference. And one of the main concerns from these workers that are still in Florida or that are getting ready for hurricane season in Florida is this strict immigration law that was signed into law by Governor Ron DeSantis last year. And in the state law, it would actually criminalize many of the workers that we interviewed with a third-degree felony for driving to cities that have been devastated by disasters, right? Because a lot of these workers don't have driver's license, they don't have a legal status, right? And this is important to note because coming into the country without proper documentation, coming into the country without inspection is a civil offense. And now we have 3 of the states where most of these workers are living and working, Florida, Louisiana, and Texas, really criminalizing them, right? Like passing state laws that turn a civil offense into a felony, right? So this is at the forefront of what the workers are talking about right now as they're getting ready for a new season, right? Because they do get ready for this. They are keyed into weather forecasts. They are trying to make sure that they're prepared because not only are they driving to these cities, they have to obviously like carry their own fuel, carry their own food, carry their own water. So they are preparing for this. But as they prepare, they also talk about these anti-immigration laws and how it's affecting their ability to do this work, right? So while Floridians will need these workers to recover from hurricanes, a lot of them are saying, is it worth it for me to go to this state and work for a few months and be under threat of being incarcerated every single day? So that I would say that that's the biggest thing that these workers are talking about. And, on the other hand, this industry will continue to grow, mostly because it's just needed. We're seeing the hurricanes in Florida. We're seeing tornadoes in the Midwest. We're seeing flash floods everywhere. So while the industry continues to grow, and I want to remind you that for the cleanup and restoration industry, you don't really need any kind of special certification to go into it. Essentially, any construction company can come in and start doing this work. So there's very little regulation. OSHA is very hands off, and the demand just keeps growing. So I'm not sure what the future holds, but I can tell you that these workers take pride in helping people rebuild. I saw that quite a bit with workers who cleaned after Hurricane Katrina, and how they're experiencing New Orleans now after rebuilding it.
So they're really putting their bodies on the line, but there isn't much, even as you point out, in the nearly 2 decades since Katrina, nothing much has changed in terms of protections or people looking out for them.
Exactly.
I mean, is there some positive news at all? One thing that struck me about this piece was you come back to the two brothers, Mariano and Santos, at the end of it. They're like, look, we've got protective equipment now, but they provided it themselves. So are there some folks either at the state or federal level or at any other level who are doing something to try and make things better for these folks?
Yeah, I think the help is coming from two ends, right? Like what the thing that we reported on is that a lot of these workers are helping each other. So now there are worker-led organizations like the Resilience Force, like Familias Unidas en Acción in New Orleans. So there's that communal support that they're teaching each other about how to stay safe, right? Like wearing the right mask or wearing the right protective gear or being able to even identify the toxins like asbestos, right? But also we have, some efforts on the federal level. Representative Jaya Paul introduced a bill that would essentially create a workforce for folks who are already doing this work. It would establish a temporary immigrant status, right? Which would give them proper documentation so they could do the work. But the legislation hasn't really gotten a lot of movement. The bill was co-sponsored by 43 Congress people, but it really hasn't moved past committee. And I don't necessarily see a lot of movement on that. And it's also worth noting that it's called the Climate Resilience Workforce Act. It doesn't really address OSHA's role in all of this, which is a big, big thing that the workers, talked a lot about, just not having any protection or not having anyone they can turn to if there are working conditions or like dangerous working conditions.
We've been speaking with journalist Maria Inés Zamudio with the Center for Public Integrity. She's part of the team that included Futuro Investigates and Columbia Journalism Investigations, reporting on toxic working conditions facing Latino disaster recovery workers. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Matthew.
That's our show for this week. Grayson Doctor is our executive producer. Subscribe to Florida Matters wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Matthew Petty. Thanks for listening.